So,
Grace, you've put your hand up. You've got a question for Daniel.
Yeah, what you've already been speaking about really brings up for me this interesting tension between, because people are always like, okay, we're creating a database or we're creating a knowledge repository. And I come from a technology background. I'm like, well, what about AI that's going to match your bioregion to the right template? And then you're also pointing at something that even what worked this year might not work next year. And I'm just curious about this tension between like having the knowledge accessible, having templates that we can share, sharing our knowledge, and also listening to the earth itself. Like you're pointing at this tension between all these different sources of information and like you said, rigid versus, you know, discovering. So like, how are you thinking about that tension? How are you thinking about all these different sources of information about how to do regeneration?
Well, I have a couple of little things that I do with my own thinking, or try to do, and please call me up if I don't do it properly. When I hear myself framing something too strongly as we need to go from this to that, that's the old paradigm, this is the new paradigm, you're wrong here, this is all right, don't you get it, come join me. Then I'm always asking the question, is there any value in what the past system tried to do? Because I assume, and this is a fundamental basic assumption, that life is benevolent and that we're actually all trying to do the right thing, apart from a few sociopaths that do exist and that derail the system quite significantly. But if we always ask what's valuable in the old, what's like, I learned this when I did the master's in holistic science, and all these well-meaning teachers couldn't find a language that wasn't somehow dismissing reductionist quantity-based analytical science that was using AI as something like a mistaken approach. At the same time, when we look at the participatory, experiential, deeply connected understanding that science is now approaching, that indigenous cultures have held for millennia, that there is a relationship between the dimension of mind and how we look at the world and how the world shows up to us, that brings in sensing, feeling, intuiting that is beyond AI, and it is beyond the cold analytical data analysis. And when we look at systemic interconnections, we have to dance with the paradox. So to come closer to your question, with all these paradoxes, I always remember a friend of mine who once said, if you step on a paradox, you can be sure to have some truth on your shoes. And I think that's a nice thing to remember, because it just slows you down when you kind of feel there's a clash of things. And in the regenerative framing, there's often an activating and a restraining force, and there's wisdom in both of these forces. And how do we use them and learn from them rather than entrench and divide them? And so does that answer your question in any way?
It gives an approach.
Repeat it, like,
it gives an approach, yeah.
Hold me in a little bit more. What's missing? Like, what would you like me to say?
So I have this sense that there's like a tension between business right now, and there's sort of a divergence between business as usual and this growing movement of people, because I come from the traditional world. Like, I don't come from this regenerative world. I come from the business world, but there's a growing movement towards the regenerative world. But the tools of the regenerative world are much more intuitive and much less technologically informed. I mean, if you think about how crops are grown today in industrial agriculture, they've got sensors and they've got all this stuff, and they know exactly what they did, and all these measurements and all this AI and all the Watsons, and we're like, oh, I'm just going to buy a little parcel of land and I'm going to feel into it. And it feels like there's this, I don't think it's necessarily competition, but it feels like, there's a movement that is less well equipped in some way.
Well, it's interesting that you see it that way. And the invitation would maybe be to look at how much of the way you even framed this as a somewhat oversketched persiflage of the situation, like is part of how aspects of the mainstream see this movement, but maybe also because they haven't looked at how deep this movement has transformed how humans interact with the earth for a long time. And even some of the assumptions are that regenerative is something like it's this new thing on the block, this utopia to create. And I think that's where when we sell it that way, which unfortunately now even people who support this movement are selling it that way, we're missing what we're rightly critiqued on with a far too wide an audience, that we're not recognizing that indigenous people all around the world have had insight in how to live regeneratively as custodians of the ecosystems that brought them forth for millennia. And that what we exactly need to do is to slow down enough and really come into the circle of understanding enough. That means that they're not primitive knowledge holders that because you have a PhD from, I don't know, MIT Media Lab and work in AI, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking in general, yeah? You're somehow so much more advanced and so much more tuned into this big data and these sensors and all this. Like, why aren't we using it? Because using it is a way of seeing, and it's a useful way of seeing. But if we are arrogantly enough to put this as the only valid way of seeing, and we somehow, even if we say, oh yeah, let's bring in indigenous knowledge, look at them a little bit like, okay, yeah, you slashed and burned and how nice, yeah. That's arrogant, that's intellectual colonialism, that's not listening to the wisdom of the circle, it's not coming home into the community of things. And while these sound fluffy, this is about human survival. If we don't restory ourselves into life's regenerative pattern that are eons old, we've had it. And that means that precisely what you're pointing to, we need to have this important conversation about how does technology serve, in what way, to what degree. But to have this conversation seriously, we need to assume that maybe we're overusing technology ridiculously. And maybe it's the classic, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. It's like, how do we scale it up? How do we digitalize it? How do we make it technologically applicable? And then good, well-meaning people generate things like change of state impact assessment on regeneratively managed land from time A to time B. Vitally necessary, important stuff. But if this becomes the only parameter of whether somebody is a good steward of the land or not, then this is a form of encirclement of the ecological commons and the social commons into the economy. So we need to watch out that sometimes by creating helpful technologies that then suddenly suppose that an Indian farmer who has farmed in with his family a certain piece of land for generations now needs to have a smartphone to get paid in seeds for what he's doing. How is that changing that worldview and a larger system that might not be so regenerative? And I have no answers, I have questions. But yeah, I hope that's
Yeah.
There are two more questions coming up. Oh.
Yes, we've got two more. And I think the art of asking better questions is what we're aiming for. Michael, Potomac Watershed, greetings.
Thank you. Hello. I hope that I can offer a better question where this is about how to be in a sacred journey and blind spots on the sacred journey. And there are differences when I am on my own sacred journey and when we are on a sacred. So learning as an individual and learning as a hive use the same language, but there are different experiences. And one of the things that for me has been part of my own sacred journey is to see a bigger picture and then either enter into a relationship to it or dismiss it. And in a place that I used to work in, the way in which the world was seen was through country units. And this is where the question is going. How we unitize the world sometimes frames then how we talk about it. And so investments were done at country levels. And when people began to see, instead of putting it at country levels, they created not bioregions, but geographically narrow investment at the city level, all of a sudden they could see that things were flowing in ways that they were investing a lot in Kenya, but it was all going into the capitals rather than into the countryside. And so they began to see and relate to the reality in a different way by seeing it more intimately. Bioregion, for me, creates a vocabulary that is more intimate and allows me to relate, to see and begin to relate with others and develop a common vocabulary with others. I struggle, and this is one of the things I love, I struggle to have that same vocabulary at the level of human systems, that we still have aggregates that are not necessarily meaningful. And so it's the question is, are there units of clustering that you find for talking about human systems that, like bioregions, can make it more accessible, more actionable, that allow people to self-organize around clusters that they can influence? I know that's a lot of, but how do we move into the sacred journey collectively out of Sangha and into city or whatever the next, whatever the unit is?
Yeah, again, just reflecting from my own perspective, I hold no truths. In your question is an assumption that human systems and bioregions as ecosystems or natural systems are somehow separate, and they're certainly separate in the narrative we created about them, but they're not separate within the biophysical reality in which we take our dwelling. And for me, the opportunity of talking about bioregionalism is to bring in work that has been done. We always need bridging means, and therefore it helps to understand certain scientific disciplines that we can bring out of the box and say, look here, there's 40 years of ecosystems change science within the Resilience Alliance community that have over 40 years come to the understanding that it's impossible to talk about ecological systems without talking about the human within that ecological system. And therefore they've then, after 20 years of research, moved from talking about change and dynamics of change in ecological systems to speaking about socio-ecological systems, recognizing that there are now no bioregions anymore that are not fundamentally affected by human activity, which is this bizarre situation we're in when they talk about the Anthropocene. And we need to understand that we need to get out of the Anthropocene as quickly as possible if you want to have a future. And for me, the path out of that is the reintegration of culture and nature in as early a stage as how we language it. So it's really important that we don't language it as other. And for me, the bioregional impulse is the collective learning process of how we can, in a world with 8 billion people, accepting that, yes, if we want to be really hard-nosed and looking at the fundamental disruptions we've already put in place, there's a cascading series of collapses happening that is destroying systems that are no longer in service to life. Life is starting to show the limits of having transgressed planetary boundaries. And therefore, for me, the bioregional approach is relearning how we can meet human needs within an ecosystem and relearn our ancient role of becoming gardeners and custodians of those ecosystems. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying that anybody has all the answers to it. And I'm not saying that it will avoid terrible trauma on the path to this redesign of the human presence on Earth. But I believe that that's the real benefit of the bioregional approach, that even if we asked from a completely different angle, which is there are fundamentally disruptions coming, how do we create the community resilience and infrastructure that will help more people to be able to respond to these disruptions and have a better chance to weathering it through these storms that we now pretty much can anticipate. we would come up with the same answer. We need to radically relocalize and re-regionalize. We need to learn our place again. And this is everything, the history, the culture, the art, the dance. There's so much richness and information held in the relational fabric of people and place that we have completely ignored, that we have to relearn. And the big dilemma, another paradox, is that we're sitting here talking about it in the abstract internationally, and we're not out there, or I'm right now not out there with my neighbors trying to learn about this in the real, in this place. And I think that's the challenge of this conference, is how do we make that bridge, that we stay with the specific and do the work in the analog, not the digital abstract, and build even better databases and even better ways to analyze it. We need to get going with it, because it's 1:25, not 5 minutes to 12. I got a bit passionate there. Sorry.
No, good. Jesse, you're up next.
Yeah, well, there's so many things to bring up.
Lovely to see you again. Hi.
Yeah. This is great. This is a great experience. I thought a week-long conference would be exhausting, and then I saw it was a 2-week conference. But it's actually pretty good. Anyway, I started as a physicist that only looks for fixed rules for things, and then noticed something fascinating, that physics never looks at the beginnings or endings of things. So that set me off on a big exploration and finding gaps, like the sustainability movement, which primarily relied on efficiency for a long time to reduce impacts, and economically that accelerates growth and so multiplies impacts and make growth more efficient. And so I realized that systems are really what's controlling our world, and we often don't understand them. And the worst example I know of is in the financial community. They don't realize that, although I've heard recently some people from the industry, really concerned about it too, they don't realize that their work is endangering their own homes and families as much as everyone else's. And the financial industry is mostly, and business are mostly, good moms and dads with great educations and who are very successful at applying their work, but following old rules that have been out of date for quite some time now. But somehow we don't have enough systems thinking in our institutions or professions to sort that out. We're more influenced by money than by reasoned knowledge. And so we have here in the biophysical world a very strongly intuitive community, but isn't yet seeing the need to communicate to people like the financial world on what I see as the basic rule of design is that first you create something and then you care for it. And that's not the principle of the economy. That is the principle of caring for a bioregion in place, is that you create things to take care of them. So how do we communicate that outside this network? How do we reach the others?
Hugely important question. And like I mentioned, Common Land and Ecosystems Restoration Camp, and really with all the limitations that then with regard to funding and how to build organizations and how to build collaboration and networks, sometimes organizations like that then get tracked into a certain way of working that can be critiqued, but they're actually intending to do something that is much more systemic. And I believe that, for example, the proposal that Willem Verweder developed with the 4 returns approach, which is a landscape scale, so therefore bioregional approach to transforming the relationship between humans and their environment over the kind of time it simply takes when you're talking about ecological systems, 20 to 25 years minimum. And he based this on the 4 returns, and the 4 returns do offer a at least conceptual bridge to bring into, you're absolutely right to point this out, Jesse, and you've done this many times, and I completely agree with you, that until we question the fundamental growth imperative and the limited significance in terms of measuring progress that GDP has as a measure, we will continue to move deck chairs on the Titanic. And while this is vitally important, we also need to do all the other things that we're talking about in this summit. And for me, there are people trying to make this bridge that you pointed out and that I think is vitally important to constructing. If we just talk about local food sovereignty, local water sovereignty, local energy sovereignty, and health, and all of those issues in separation, and we don't talk about how they affect local economies, how they generate local work, how they build community resilience against climate change and disruption, how they shorten supply chains in times of pandemics and other types of transport disruptions. We need to create those narratives that bring our bioregional projects in relationship to the economy, and particularly in times of cascading, collapsing economies and the writing on the wall of that system not being sustainable, not even that, being fundamentally degenerative in practice. It is possible to engage those players by, for example, the link between ecosystems health, planetary health, and human health. You can make really strong financial arguments around the costs of healthcare systems at the scale of local healthcare provision and bioregional healthcare provision that gives you a strategic entry point to have conversations with your local authority that you might not get by saying we're just a group of bioregionalists and we want to focus on this approach. And so yes, we need to have a, and that doesn't mean all of us need to do everything because there's many of us. But we need to connect the different strong points that each and every one of us have and build a more complex narrative that values our diversity in service to the places we live in. Does that give you any kind of answer to what you were saying? Or?
Well, yeah. I'm just saying one of the things that needs to be part of it is continuing to message the rest of the world system and not just work locally, but also communicate globally. So, a sort of think globally, act locally, and then speak globally too.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what the founder of the local futures movement, Helena Norberg-Hodge, was a long-standing friend of mine and inspiration of mine. She's always made that point that we need this dual role, that we need to highlight how fundamentally against bioregional development, current IMF trade laws, current GATT agreements, and all of those big global trade agreements. We have national governments signed up to agreements that make it impossible to favor local production and consumption against imported production and consumption, the consumption of imported goods. People could get taken to the international court, even governments, for saying things like, we want all our provisions to be 0 kilometer within the bioregion kind of thing. Both energy, food, water. It's at this current state illegal. So yes, there's a lot of fundamental redesign of these policies also necessary, but the more we strengthen local and bioregional economies, and we build the new infrastructure. Like, for example, I encourage everybody to look at the conversation that I had with a guy called Thomas Hahn, who in Germany has set up a regenerative cooperative, a new business form that makes working regeneratively, socially, ecologically, and economically part of the business world rather than part of the NGO world. And it's these vehicles we need to create, because he makes in this conversation, it's on YouTube, a vital point that as long as these conversations stay within associations and NGOs, they are a tiny little corpuscle on the side of the national and global economies. But the minute they become vehicles within that economic system, they can become actors of transformation. But of course, they can also be co-opted by it. But that's why cooperatives are good, because then it's guided by the wisdom of the crowd. Anyway, let's move on. There are two more questions I see, Reiki and Paul.
Reiki, go ahead.
Sure. So eloquent and beautiful, Daniel. Thank you for the way you're able to synthesize the problem landscape here. I have a question for what you might give as a bit of advice for those who are setting up bioregional economies and kind of opting into an infinite territory, so to speak. So for example, I'm operating in the Katua bioregion. It's in Western North Carolina. And a few other states it overlaps into. It's so hard to say where you're at when you're speaking bioregionally. And we're creating a new economic system here. So for example, there's a 100-acre campus that's teaching people about regeneration. I'm teaching such a weird way of saying this, but it's holding space for what this new civilization could look like and demonstrating that. But then working with a whole bunch of different actors across the bioregion who might have regenerative farms or co-working spaces or businesses, etc. And then we're coming together and saying, all right, we get to opt into designing an entirely new game is one way of looking at it, but economic system, so to speak. We're meeting our needs and Earth's needs, and maybe we're using donut economics as a model of what we're trying to achieve or whatever. So there's all of these movements happening right now is the landscape I'm trying to provide you of people opting into being able to design entirely new economic systems, thinking bioregionally of how we can start meeting our needs right now in a volunteer fashion. So I present that to you to say, what advice would you give to people who are entering into that landscape? Maybe some first principles to think from or practices you would do to help people really connect and understand where they're coming from before acting or anything like that that you might offer, people entering into this world right now.
Well, what I can offer is a reflection that I've noticed in a number of areas. Like, for example, I'm noticing a sort of resurgence of interest in community-based projects, people coming together and with their friends creating some sort of, what in my language, in my generation, we called eco-villages, but now they're called regen villages or whatever. But the problem is that a lot of these initiatives don't see the necessity to maybe learn from people who had the same impulse 20, 30 years ago. And since I worked a lot with the Global Eco-Village Network and Gaia Education that was born out of this movement, I just think of some of these elders, and we even named some of them with Helena Norberg-Hodge and so on. And they noticed a lot of things about the danger of creating these sandbox projects that are isolated from the regions they work in. And it sounds like you're starting from the beginning with linking the region. And I think that's vitally important, because what often happens when you create something beautiful on 50 acres or 100 acres is that it takes 10 years and you focus on those 100 acres because there's a shed load of work to do. And by the time you're done, all your locals say, these guys just look at their land and don't even say hello. And we've never really had a meal with them. And then you've created a separation. And I think a lot of the eco-village movement has lived that separation. So it's really important to not make that mistake. And then with all the wonderful opportunities that I don't fully understand, like hold my hand up here with regard to decentralized autonomous organizations, because I saw the DAO in your subscript, and currency design and all of that. My encouragement would be hedge your bets and don't create a system that is entirely digitally focused. Always ask the question, how would we create a system that is face-to-face and human relationship building in this bioregion? And there are people like, if you look at the website of the Post-Growth Institute, they have wonderful material. And just recently I saw that they're sharing work that was done by Shareable, the network Shareable, which offers 300 ways, practical ways to make regional economic activity and local economic activity thriving. That's the kind of repository, and that's the kind of like tick list of experiments to say, how would we do this here? And just be, as you say, be playful about it, and just make it little explorations in your regions based on those. I mean, whether it's community supported agriculture or tool sharing or all these other things that you can set up. It's not just about the use value of these things. It's about how these things build the capacity for people to talk to each other, to collaborate, to know each other, to map the system that they're part of. And that's, I think, is vital work these days. So yeah, the work like open source ecology with different toolkits that people can rely on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It's just, I know when you're bringing challenges of, scaling and technology and currencies and kind of those old tools of thinking. So I was, so 100% yes to everything. I was just adding one more question for you, is where do you see the appropriate use? And maybe I hope you get really biased here, of some of these emerging, infinitely scalable technologies, kind of like AI, crypto, all of that, fits under the same umbrella. That it is very digital. A solar flare could theoretically wipe all of this out in a heartbeat. So like, what do you see as the appropriate role of these types of technologies? Is it similar to, I think you made a statement once that, gasoline's most appropriate role today was just helping us, create regenerative ecosystems. So like if we employed it for that purpose, great. So is it a similar ideology for these, AI scalable technologies, or what do you think?
First, to give credit where credit is due, that was Buckminster Fuller who said, yeah, like maybe the fossil fuels are just the starter engine of spaceship Earth, but that's still a mechanistic metaphor for planet Earth. And we need organismic metaphors, I think. But that's a massive question. And I do have a bias on that, probably towards the more Luddite side of things. That I believe that if we wed our future too much on technology and computers analyzing data for us, and surrender to the narrative that humans are just a pest on the planet and we need AI to tell us how we manage resources wisely so we can rein ourselves in, then we actually don't see the other narrative, which is no, our innate heritage is the capacity to be regenerative. And each cell in your body has been doing that for the last 24 hours. And we're all walking ecosystems and not individuals. We're full of non-human cells. And if we come from that perspective, it doesn't mean that we have to dismiss the capacity to communicate in the way that we're now communicating and dismiss technology. No, to the contrary, I think we need to grow up to the point that we stop thinking either or, and we say, how do we build these radically re-regionalized bioregions? But what are the core technologies that we want these bioregions to have so they can learn from each other and exchange? And how do we balance things that are impossible or hard to produce locally, whether it's in food or other resources in a region? And how do we keep and power a global trade system that is radically reduced, but still vital for the well-being of everybody in those bioregions? So it's not a question of technology or not technology, local or global. It's a question of how do we radically re-regionalize and relocalize while building the global networks. And for that, we do need technology, and we will need mining for a while. And for those who haven't seen it, it's a real wake-up call. My friend Olivia Lazard from Carnegie Foundation Europe gave a TED talk. If you put Olivia Lazard, the blind spot of the green energy transition, she summarizes in 18 minutes how the kind of Elon Musk-esque dream of the future is just like, I won't even say it. Encourage you to look at that as well, but that doesn't mean all electric cars are bad and everybody who puts a solar panel on their roof doesn't get it. We need to find a bit more nuanced ways of working on this, and particularly not othering people, but seeing that while we have maybe different tags, they can all be useful. And that's, for me, technology that the knee-jerk reaction about technology is because it's been so powerful and the money is so concentrated in the technology sector, we favor technological solutions. And I think if we want to make it through the eye of the needle as a species, we need to have the maturity to understand that just because we have powerful tools, we don't need to use them. And part of being wise is to know when to use your tool. And the more powerful a wizard, the less magic he uses. So maybe that's a general point. Like I'm trying to have a conversation with Daniel Schmachtenberger about this, because he also is highly critical of exponential tech, but he has given up on believing that we can rein it in. So that's a tricky one. Killian, long time no see. Hi.
I don't think we've ever actually seen each other, just past
but we had some
on Twitter and such.
We had some grumpy exchanges, but that's okay. Lovely to see you.
yeah, it is actually quite nice to be here and actually interacting with you. So lots of things to react to. I've done a lot in the chat, of course, which is going to probably piss a lot of people off, but I just want to support what you just said very quickly about Simon and add on to it. Simon Michaud, I had an interview with him. Nate Higgins has done work with him, and so has I think Steve Keen. The people really need to kind of get familiar with the resources issue and how it limits so much of what is talked about. When people start talking about AI and stuff, and I'm like, resources, windmills, resources. It doesn't matter what you talk about. It's really a powerful limiter to what we're trying to do. That's not my main point, though.
Just briefly, before you get to the main point, just as a little add-on there, I have a friend, complete like geek par excellence. He used to be head of innovation at Hewlett-Packard Labs when they were inventing the dot matrix printer, and said into the room, couldn't we print in 3D with this? And the rest is history. He's been retired for 20 years, and for 20 years, he, as a chemist, he 20 years ago sat down and looked at the periodic table and came to the same conclusion as Janine Benyus with the Biomimicry Institute, that for a long-range regenerative civilization to run a material culture, the chemical elements that material culture has to be built on primarily is carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. And if you want the agricultural circle in it, it has to be phosphorus and sulfur as well. So CHNOPS. And if you don't innovate thinking long range, how would we get to a CHNOPS future where with local ambient temperature at local and regional scale, we can melt down our material products back into something that we can then use locally available renewable energy to put it into a new thing? We're not building something that is sustainable for thousands or 10,000s of years. We maybe buy ourselves 500 years or 1,000 years, but since we're doing a fundamental redesign, let's do it properly. But yeah, that's a small but important side sentence. Over to you.
No, you're absolutely correct. I'm so glad you said that. I say that all the time. I try to explain this to people, that if we don't build out what we should be building out rapidly now, above all else, is the recycling ability. Above all else. Not the windmills, the recycling ability, because without that, you can't do the rest of it. You're absolutely correct. It's really hard to get that through to people, though, who don't know energy, don't know resources, etc. And that's unfortunate, but it's part of the conversation we got to keep having.
For those people listening, look at energy return on energy invested and look at material return on energy invested. Because if we're looking at material return on energy invested for a gram of gold, we're in a very strange part of the way. Anyway, I'm sorry. Let's get into
So I'm on Club Deck, and I have an interview with Simon Michaud in Regenerative Governance group there, or club there, if anyone wants to try and find that. So anyway, sorry. You mentioned the 4 returns, and I've been frustrated by the 4 returns for a long time because of the financial addition to it, right? Because financial returns instantly make something non-regenerative, as I understand things. So here's my question, because it seems pretty obvious to me, but maybe you do disagree with this. But I'm wondering if, and because this is a big part of the trying to have these conversations, it gets really hard because you find that you're talking about now versus transition versus endpoint so often. And so often we're actually talking at different parts of it. And it makes the conversation really hard. And I try to always bring conversations down to that when I notice it's getting confused. And so I try to ask people, are you talking about transition, or are you talking about where we end up? We all know where we are now. Are you talking about transition or endpoint, or the regenerative state after the transition? So for the financial side part of it, do you see that as being part of the endpoint or just a transition?
Brilliant question. But I know Willem personally, and I'm speaking for Willem, and he might disagree here, but he's a wonderfully, really deep thinking man who's deeply in love with the wider community of life and wants to serve it. And as somebody who tried to be a protector of ecosystems within the IUCN and successfully managed IUCN Netherlands, he developed this system in order to create a conceptual bridge for people to engage in this deep conversation that you cannot protect anything you care for in your bioregion unless you somehow also find a way at this point, so I'm talking Horizon 1 to Horizon 2 space, to value what you value within the economic context and understand that you can't ask people to protect it unless they have a way to feed their children and so on and so forth. And by using this four return framework and beginning to actually look at the projects that they've been engaged in for a number of time, beginning to tell the story that the initial pump priming of bringing local stakeholders together and investing 500,000 a year for 4 or 5 years in a region to work in space holding, warm data labs, in my ways, I would need much more diverse methodologies than just taking a few stakeholders through a theory U, which is what they do. But if they invested that kind of money into local change agents to bring local people together, and to some extent that's what they're doing, and then invite people to change their primary production patterns towards regenerative agriculture and build new cooperatively owned enterprises and enterprise ecologies, they can actually, within the current system, demonstrate that there is an economic backflow to this initial pump priming investment that can get more people to onboard more quickly. But I would venture, and I don't know this for sure, that Willem is aware that if you, which is a hard sell, and this is the thing that I pull most my hat off for him, is that he has gone to funders that were willing to engage with him for 3 or 4 years and has said, sorry, you don't get what I'm saying. I'm not taking your money. Either you engage with me for 20 years or you don't engage me with me at all. And if you do that, which he mainly did, focused on the fact that ecosystems take 20 years to be transformed towards better or the worse, the worse is a lot quicker. It's also saying, we know the world is changing quickly, and will people still be in the same mindset as they are now in 20 years' time? And to some extent, I believe that the need for demonstrating economic return within the narrow or financial return, which is even more closely defined framing of our current economic system, is irrelevant in 20 years' time. But you don't need to lead with that conversation, because then you don't get the economic players in. It's the same weird paradox that John Fullerton is trying to dance with his old mates in the financial industry. And yes, there are many ways of looking at this in a very critical way. And I sense into people's integrity and try to see if they really want to be of service in building bridges between people that otherwise don't talk to each other. And in that space, I think that even sometimes these triggering memes, like when this language, I've just had this with students this morning of the Lucerne, they were basing everything on ecosystem services. And I was reminding them, like, look, that isn't capturing, that's enclosure. You bring the commons into the economic system the minute you give economic value to an ecosystem. And at the same time, it helps build a conceptual bridge that we can then critique and evolve from. I don't know, but what's your thought on that?
Well, I don't have a problem with what you said, and it drives me to a question back to you. My thought is that I'm not worried about what we say to the bankers. I know they don't get it. Right? I'm not worried about what we say to the president of the United States. He doesn't get it. You know, I'm not worried about anybody outside of the circle. In terms of what does concern me is that people inside the circle, and by that I'm trying to make a general point about activists, you know, green people, etc., whatever we want to, you know, identify as, or what we is that those of us that are doing the activism to try to create regenerativity, right? What I find is within that circle, there's an awful lot of maybe not understanding that that fourth part, that financial thing, is a temporary thing, or seems to, I mean, really seems to need to be. If you look at the principles of regenerative systems versus the principles of our current system, they're really different. And so I don't see how the one is still there at the end. But what worries me is that we have people within the circle who see something like the four returns and think that's the end point. That's my concern.
Okay, no,
I don't know if
no, thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.
Because,
I'm going to pause on that. It's a really great discussion. It could be much longer, but Donna's been waiting very patiently to ask a question.
Okay.
We've got 4 minutes left, so forgive me for jumping in there.
Okay.
Donna, over to you.
Lovely to finally meet you.
Can we point out, though, we don't have to leave this room and stop, right? There's nothing else happening here. So if people want to linger and keep going, I don't know about you, Daniel, but that is possible.
But I have another meeting at 7, and I need to go there. So I can do another 10 minutes extra. So, but yeah, sorry, Donna. Donna, hello, nice to meet you again.
It's so nice to see you again. And I will try to keep this brief because I know how nourishing a conversation like this is, that's touching on so many threads. And I did watch the opening plenary where the themes of paradox and dancing with paradox and the word and, which we need to learn to fall in love with, because the issues we're talking about, they need all of us, and that's going to take time. And there aren't silver bullet answers. There are some answers, clearly. There are some things that are more right. And yet, you know, we're often fond of saying being right is never enough. It's so what? You know, if the only thing was to figure out how to be right, then we would have been farther along even now. And so it brings it back to the and between local and global, not either or, meeting people where they're at and figuring out how to do that. So life is a living lab. We're here right now with each other, and we know that the real action happens out there. It's not really here, but we do the best we can when we're here in this space with each other. And what we're observing is a lot of division even amongst those that are on the same side, and I put that in quotes, in terms of desperately wanting to help with this journey of regeneration, and yet there are very different ways of looking at that. So the work that we're doing, which is very much Commons work, is the building the bridges. How can we get more rigorous around some of the collaborative impact research that we can do that provide more demonstrations of how things really do start to happen at that bioregional level? How can we learn more about what it means to truly collaborate? And just as the Eskimos have different words for snow, I think what we're learning is that there's all kinds of different kinds of collaboration, and we need to learn how to do that in many, many different contexts. And that's what our work is all about. So I stand here with great humility in terms of everybody in this room and all the work that you've done for many, many years, Daniel, and basically saying, not here as the expert about bioregional regeneration, but what we are bringing is around the rigorous learning that needs to happen and learning exchange across regions, honoring the good work on the ground, not an either or, discovering more about the patterns, living into those questions, and making adaptation as we go and getting over ourselves. Because, you know, at some level, we keep coming back to saying nobody has the answers, but it's, you know, fractal-like. And even the conversation, I'm going to stop here because I'm getting passionate, but even the conversations we have in here, it's a recognition that we're not going to talk this way everywhere, because there's some people that we would lose at hello just by talking in the ways that we're talking here right now.
But isn't that so? So two things. Like, first of all, like just as a vignette that somehow explains my way to an insight that I think is relevant here. When I decided that it's a fundamental mistake of all authors to write a book and when it's out, think it's finished, and then wonder, why is nobody buying and reading my book? Well, the truth is there's so many books being published that they just don't know it exists, and it's not their fault that they don't. And I realized that giving it away was the best way of making people interested. There might be some value. So I started putting my entire book, breaking my contract actually, and making it available on Medium. And then I started sharing material that I'd written 10, 15, 20 years ago. And part of me was like the modern way of thinking or the academic way of thinking, how could I possibly, it's full of mistakes, and there's like the way even some of the memes I use, I wouldn't use today anymore, and all of that. But then the response was that whatever helped me from one level of insight to another level of insight was still very significant for people at this point, because we're all on different parts of the journey in different aspects where we're still learning and where we've already learned. And that's why we can learn so much from each other. And so in that sense, I would encourage that we keep that learning alive. But the other thing that you were speaking quite strongly to is that you meant rigorous twice and impact assessment. And yes, we need rigor. And yes, we need to somehow create baselines that tell us this is where we started our intervention work or our co-designing work or our intention of improvement, and how are we doing? And by using the tools of impact assessment currently, which is mainly quantity-focused analysis, or even the so-called qualitative analysis processes ultimately store data in a linear quantitative way. We are actually maybe not serving like this. I see this with a lot of people in business. They're all called like, please give me this question rubric like I got from the guys from B Corp, and then I know how I'm doing in being regenerative. And that would be the opposite of being regenerative, to ever even try to create this question rubric.
Yep.
And so for me, how do we generate impact assessment in a way that is human, based on narrative and storytelling? Like I always envision that 3 90-second videos of small children talking about how this intervention has changed my life, when the intervention was whatever, 2 million of investment in regenerative agriculture in the region, is a much more powerful feedback than some bullshit statistic that even Churchill knew, that don't trust a statistic you haven't fudged yourself. Anyway, sorry, I got passionate.
No, I know, but can I just respond quickly and then
yeah, okay.
Yeah,
brief.
sorry, there's a hand up. Really quickly. It's why when you speak so passionately as well about the importance of human spirit, culture, arts, all of that is part of the richness of this, and not either or, and warm data, and all of the different things that have been discussed. So we need to learn how to do this, and it includes it includes learning ways of legitimizing this, bringing all of this in without labels necessarily, without requiring people to read all the books. They will learn it by being it. And that's, I think, what we mean by being the change.
It just, as you were saying, I was thinking about a response, and what came to mind, and you've heard me talk about this before,
yeah.
I learned this not from Jung directly, but from Stefan Harding at Schumacher College, who's been a great mentor of mine. And Stefan does this beautiful dance between Gaian theory and deep ecology and Jungian psychology. And in order to make us more deeply understand the amplification of reconnecting to the fullness of human capacity that is involved in holistic science, he used Jung's mandala of the 4 ways of knowing: thinking, feeling, intuiting, and sensing. And everything that we're currently doing with science and technology in our discourse, everything we're doing when we're looking at impact assessment, is ultimately expressed within and analyzed within, through AI increasingly, that thinking way seeing and knowing. And what would be really interesting in terms of what your ultimate question was, how do we bring people closer into this, is a little graphic. Anybody can start drawing it up, please, of these 4 ways of knowing, like the wheels of the 4 directions in the center, and then showing how so much of our approaches are clustered in the thinking way. But then we do have art, dance, poetry, cultural traditions in place, growing out of place, that are not of that type. And they also inform validly how we can move wisely into the future. So anyway, that was just food for thought. Now, 2 of my absolute favorite people in the world, Anne and Neil. Hi. Oh, I can't hear you. Hi, Neil.
Sorry, who, us?
Yeah, you two. You just, this is for those who don't know these two. They basically met through their shared passion for all this work and are now living together. And I get all teary eyes seeing them.
Stop it. Daniel was one of our matchmakers. No, we came. Thank you for that part of the narrative. We came together through a shared understanding of collapse. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to share that with us. There's an away from and a towards. Okay, and Killian has mentioned this, it's come up several times, there's elements of consciousness. I spent this morning in the forest with the fungi. Mm-hmm. Why do I know where the fungi are? Because they sprout at this time of year, they have the fruiting bodies on the surface, but the mycorrhizae are there the whole time. But the fungi can only fruit when the conditions are right. And the conditions are right because it's wet and it's moist and it's autumn, but it's 24 degrees in Leuven, in Belgium. Antonio Guterres is saying we're heading for climate collapse. We know this is happening in Sudan. We know this is happening in multiple places around the world, and Putin could press a button tomorrow. So the galvanizing force for movement is away from, right? The where do we go to is towards, and people can accidentally create towards models. And what we've got here is nice to have regenerative models that are critically important to the seeding and fruiting bodies of fungi. We are the mycorrhizae. How do we create the conditions for more people to realize that this is so necessary, which is part of what Killian was saying around the financial system, on what stage in the journey are we? So mm-hmm. Coming back to Daniel's beautifully explicated model of the 3 horizons, we've got all 3 horizons simultaneously, but we know Horizon 1 is in collapse. And we know that most of the technologies currently promoted in Horizon 2 minus are not viable and will never be viable. And we know most of the things being promoted in H2 positive are unlikely to be sustainable because we can't afford to give electric batteries to everybody on the planet. And we've got 8 billion people competing for resources in place-based systems that are no longer sustainable, with traditional knowledge that is no longer potentially viable because the whole climate has changed. I mean, polar bears have indigenous knowledge, and they're dying in Svalbard, right, on the rocks. So we need mechanisms for raising awareness of the calamity that is upon us and the towards. And that is the universal away from, and in our universal interests, we need to be moving away from. So there's a direction to all of this. And the direction is so critical because it is this regenerative community stuff. But it isn't going to happen at the scale and the pace required unless more people in the existing system that have all of these beautiful goods, services, and current finances to compost, that we're actually going to get fungal bodies.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with everything you've said. I think you've probably seen this, but for those who don't, like I've been grappling quite a lot with this how important is it to fully assume the fullness of the dimension of collapses, plural, that we have been in for a long time and that we are in the middle of and that are coming hard and fast. And then just as another little resource, if you Google Doomer Optimism, which if you don't know that podcast series, it's great. And we pulled together Kate Rayworth, Nora Bates, and Joe Brewer, and I, with Jason Snyder facilitating, into a conversation around different perspectives on how to handle collapse. And again, we've had paradoxical like we all appreciate each other, and at the same time we don't have necessarily exactly the same suggestion of how to where to put the energy. And I remember Kate Raworth saying, just because there's an iceberg coming and we know the iceberg is there, I don't need to stand and yell iceberg, iceberg, iceberg. Okay, that metaphor is slightly flawed because we've hit the iceberg long ago and we are thinking. But she was making a point of sometimes we still need to find these onboarding mechanisms and find ways of beginning to build solution approaches and solution spaces that ultimately build capacity for people in place to meet uncertainty, no matter what form it will take. And looking at where have they gone there? Looking at the fungal example you spent this morning on looking at fungi, is the fruiting body disintegrates completely, but the mycelium continues, which means that maybe all the regenerative infrastructure, technological solutions, DAOs, blah, 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 tools we are developing are only about building our capacity to understand the whole system, to understand our vital role of participating in the system as custodians, not as cancer. Stop talking about humans as cancer on the planet. We can be regenerative, and we have been regenerative for the long journey of humanity. And in that, I see potential. And I can ask myself, do I make the right decision spending an hour talking to you when I still don't have solar panels on my roof because I need to deep adapt to what's coming? But I don't believe that whether I have solar panels or not will make the difference. What will make the difference is who I know, how I know them, and what I know about this island, what capacity of food growing I've helped to put into place in this turbulent interlude to what will probably be the most traumatic period humanity has ever experienced. I mean, if you have, we don't like looking at that. I don't like looking at that, and I find it terribly disabling to look at it for too long. How deeply things are going wrong, and the attachment to the human story, the attachment to us having to survive, is also an attachment out of this somewhat anthropocentric narrative. If in the process to deep adaptation to a transforming environment, we so deeply become expressions of place again, that we eventually understand it doesn't really matter whether humanity continues or our ancestors continue. But if we have built the capacity of the whole system to be more regenerative and more abundant in that time, we've made a difference. And until it gets to that faraway point, we need to build the capacity of people in place to live in this tumultuous, disrupted world. And I believe if we want to build these capacities, we need to build local and bioregional structures and the capacity for global learning and solidarity. And we know that a lot of collapse is coming, but one lesson that I take from uncertainty is that nobody can tell you with certainty that we've had it, because that's not acknowledging that complex dynamic systems are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable. Of course, we can say that at some point our sun is going supernova and our solar system will blow up, but there's a lot of story of human narrative to be co-created on the way. And I think that if we want to have another chapter, even if it is only a few thousand years, it will be a bioregional chapter.
Beautiful answer. Thanks, Daniel. And you've also been reading our website. So the point I was going to make was, sorry, just if I can just finish up, the beauty, goodness, and truth is still there. Right? You have to seek that out. This is the spiritual connection with place. This is the spiritual connection with the land, and it's leaving a legacy beyond human. It's not just about us. This is beyond human. And we leave this meeting, unfortunately, very shortly to go and join a food forest conversation in our local region. And so we're living in in an organic garden. We're bringing beauty, goodness, and truth into the world, but we also face the reality and live the questions together. And that's what we're trying to do. So thank you very much for your contribution, Daniel. And we look forward to connecting again as soon as we can.
I can't wait
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Daniel, I'm just checking in on time. You're welcome to keep going, but I recognize you've got something else happening after this. How do you feel?
5 minutes, because that gives me enough time to get ready before I need to leave and meet.
Well, I have an important comment to make. I thought you came to a wonderful conclusion with the conviction that we could be caretakers of the earth, and that's an important thing. But there's an enormous gap in the thinking here and everywhere else that we see so clearly how growth systems can collapse, and that we're in the middle of one, but we're not paying attention to how growth systems don't collapse. Nature mostly builds growth systems to create long enduring new structures. It's a building process of creating systems and organizations. And there's a turning point that averts collapse that I found 40 years ago. I've been talking about, everybody's been writing me off for, but it's very present and real. It's for the people in finance to realize that they're destroying their own world and that they need to change the plan from wrecking the system to taking care of it.
Jesse,
and that's possible.
Sorry,
That's a possible transformation of intention, and we don't have good research on where the money should go. It's likely to go to mollifying pains and fears, and that might not be helpful all the time. But
just sorry, babe. In the interest of time, because this is such a big project, could you please maybe talk to Ben and Isabel and see whether you can offer a space to go more deeply into this, and then
I have one Tuesday.
Okay, great. See, there we go. Because this is like I can't answer, and I just want to briefly, because she hasn't said anything yet, want to give Lisa a chance. But yes, wonderful. So when on Tuesday coming next week, what
11
time?
a.m. Eastern.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Lisa.
Thank you. First, I'll just let Jesse, I honor your thought, but the financial system isn't set up to support the planet, and nor would they change it. But that's my personal opinion. I want to go more to where we just were talking before, and I'll be brief because I heard you're on your way out. And I was just having a little one-on-one on the side quickly, and we were talking about collapse, and someone Grace had mentioned that, that she didn't feel that people were emotionally able to, well, anyway, let me go to the state. Grace had made a comment, and I call it cognitive dissonance. It's called cognitive dissonance when someone can't look at what's right in front of them because it so much pulls the rug out from underneath them. And she had said, I think people haven't been trained to learn their emotions. And I'm like, absolutely. Unfortunately, our society has evolved so much. I work as a shadow worker for a living, and I teach people to go into and hold space for their unresolved emotions. We're just told so many people have to keep a good face on and do your job and focus and redirect on other things. And part of our weather, whether it's ancient indigenous, I studied with a Native American and an indigenous Mayan shaman. And it's part of the indigenous people's belief that not only are we connected completely to the world as individuals, but as a collective, as a race. And our emotions affect our weather. Anger is attached to fire. Grief is attached to water. I'm not saying the earth doesn't have its own cycles in and of itself. I'm a massive scientist and studied all this along with everybody else. But one thing that I haven't heard a conversation about is that, and I'm all for, like, I think a lot of people here might have seen the movie Don't Look Up, because they show the end of the world, that last few minutes. What are you doing? Some people are having dinner, some are drinking, some are making love, and I don't believe this is the end. I believe this is our opportunity to recreate a new world. I believe that it's about growing a spine and a pair. I'm a spiritual awakening facilitator, but I'm not one of those woo-woo only focus on the light. We all have light and darkness in us. and we have to own all of it. And all of them out there doing this, we've been them in a past life. We've played roles as cowboys and Indians, and who's to say who's the cowboy and Indian? I'm part Native American, so I would say, but I'm sure I've been the cowboy too. So it's a collective experience, and it's time for human evolution. And that is, we only utilize 20 of our potential 64 DNA codons right now. Most of us only use 4 to 6% of our brain capacity. And it's about us taking responsibility and not being pushed to a breaking point where, yes, it looks like we're definitely going to die if we don't make a change. So we are going to be forced as a collective and individuals within that collective to be able to grow, open our hearts, break them wide open, and be able to make space. It's grow or go on this planet. And you open your heart, you grow a spine, and we start making choices for the benefit of all. And that's what this group is about. And so I don't believe we're powerless. I believe as we wake up, we have the capacity to influence the systems in all of that. And we will create a new outcome. I don't fear surrender. I mean, I don't feel the end of the world in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you for speaking up to that, because it very strongly reminded me of one of the most important influences on my work was John Macy. And John Macy in the 1980s and 90s, where the world was again talking about the end of the world is near and we're going to have nuclear Armageddon. And don't you know, like I lived in Munich, we had SS-20 and Pershings pointing at a place 2 kilometers from my house. And when I was 11, I had a conversation with my brother about what would we do if we knew they had pressed the button and we had 7 minutes left. Yeah. So, and we're still here. And so there's no point in getting too much at yelling iceberg, even if we accept that trauma will be coming at us. But then, so I
absolutely.
The early work of John Macy was called Despair and Empowerment Work. And it was basically speaking to what we're now speaking to, which is we need to face the reality of the collapse that is already in the middle of. I just recently, Daniel Schmachtenberger, who speaks very systemically and intelligently and eloquently about all of this, was in 20th of October. If you put in 20th of October, Daniel Schmachtenberger video, you probably find it. Just recently, he spoke at a foundation in Norway, in Sweden. And in a kind of sentence, he just said, yeah, and 25,000 people died today. And that of hunger, that's the important bit. So we need to understand that trauma is around us and we are the privileged ones. And yes, we are going through a species level rite of passage, and we have that capacity to come back to what you're speaking to. And I mean,
it's called initiation. We don't have it in our culture anymore.
Exactly. Basically, when we took the wrong turn of not being bioregional custodians anymore, that mostly lived nomadic in their region and started to create power overstructured by agriculture and building city-states and empires, we created a detour that we now need to correct. But there is this capacity to come back to it. But we've also learned a lot of skills, learned a lot of technology, and this is the big rite of passage thing that we're going through. It's like either we come back to that insight that we are life, expressing life's fundamental principle of creating conditions conducive to life, or we think we can continue our systems any further, and then we will not make it through that rite of passage. And I think in this deeper way of waking up to the capacity to meet what's coming, including the trauma, in a deeper way, I think it's vitally important to actually reenact rite of passage work at a smaller scale.
Absolutely.
We need the way of counsel. We need vision fasts. We need processes that help people come back into contact with nature. The work that Joanna Macy then developed based on despair and empowerment work was called the work that reconnects, and they're global facilitators that know how to work with this. And
I'm a shadow worker for a living.
Exactly.
And I've already started doing that very work. But can I just complete my thought quickly? Because I won't even be a minute.
I
very quickly
continue.
Because we've come to this point with humanity before, coming to our full power, and we've blown it up in various different ways. But fear is not going to help us. And I have a definition Bravery is reacting and going no and not accepting fear in spite of it. Courage is feeling the fear and embodying it and being able to hold space and choose how you act anyway. This is a time for building courage, and it is initiation, and I believe we're going to get through it, but it is emotional. So thank you for everyone. Thank you. This was a wonderful conversation.
It is a wonderful conversation. It could clearly go on for hours and hours. We have to let Daniel go, but thank you so much, Daniel, for being here. For all the great questions that everybody asked. We're just really starting things here. We don't see the summit as being only for 2 weeks. We hope we're going to start lots of conversations that run and run beyond the summit. We want to keep the whole thing going.
Wonderful.
Learning, connecting, sharing, encouraging each other, not getting too doomy, but saying we can do it.
And I will see you again on Monday, no?
Yeah, see you again on Monday. Absolutely. Great. Daniel and I have a conversation then. I can't wait because I was just itching to say things today, but this is not my space. This is your space, Daniel. Okay.
Thank you so much for everyone. And it's been really lovely to see familiar faces, and particularly, and I'm so glad that we met and had a chat, because I think we just got off on the wrong foot in early days of the conversation. And I think I have to unblock you on Facebook.
Not me, Dan. You got off on the wrong foot. I'm okay. I never minded.
That is another conversation for another time.
Okay.
I think part of that conversation has to do with the dealing with when we disagree on stuff and how we disagree. Because we got to be able to disagree, and yet
I disagree with that, Donna.
Bye, Daniel. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.